Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back for the next segment of our Distinguished Speaker Series. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rodica Damian. She is an assistant professor of psychology at University of Houston, not Houston University, University of Houston. She did her PhD at UC Davis in personality psychology, but we'll talk a little bit more about her work momentarily. After that, she did a postdoc at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And prior to that, she did her bachelor's degree at Jacobs University in Bremen, Germany. She has more than 25 publications in all of the top journals in social and personality psychology, including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Psychological Science. She's mostly focused on several different topics, including personality factors that are related to career success, creativity, psychological well-being. She's done work on how life experiences or diversifying experiences impact personality and later life success, including work on birth order, socioeconomic status, and the effects of automation on careers, how automation is going to impact careers. And she's also done work on how people overcome adversity and go on to thrive in their careers. She has an H-index of 14, more than 700 citations, including more than 200 just last year alone. So if you do the math on that, you can see there's clearly some exponential growth there. She's received a number of honors and awards. I've just picked out a few of them. In 2018, the Association for Psychological Science named her a rising star in the field of psychological science. In 2015, well actually the award was in 2017, but she won an award in 2017 for her paper written in 2015 at the Journal of Research and Personality, was considered the best paper published in the journal that year. And in 2013, she won the Division 10 Frank Barron Award, which is the Division for Creativity and Aesthetics of APA, for superior research on those topics. So I think it goes without saying that she's an incredibly impressive career, although it's really just getting started, and we're really happy to have her here today. And so please join me in welcoming Rodica.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, and I'm very honored to be here today and share with you some of my research. So when you think of a highly successful person, what are the stories that we tell to try to explain their success? And to start, I'd like to take the example of Alexander Hamilton, one of America's forefathers and George Washington's right-hand man and the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and the main character of my favorite musical, which is coming to Tulsa shortly. So what does his life tell us, and kind of how does popular culture think of career success across the lifespan? So if you ask psychologists, they might say that personality and intelligence are the most important predictors of lifetime success. And this is reflected in Lin-Manuel Miranda's lyrics. So the $10 founding father without the father got a lot farther by working a lot harder and by being a lot smarter. So that's basically personality and intelligence there. If you ask a sociologist, they might say that it's all about the socioeconomic background. On average, people who come from a lower socioeconomic background would have lower later career success. But then, as the lyrics of the musical say as well, it's sometimes surprising things happen. So Hamilton was from a very impoverished family. His father left him when he was 10, his mother died when he was 12, then he was living with a cousin who committed suicide. So he was all alone, and yet low SES, but he made it anyway. Which brings me to the next point, which are life experiences and development. We tell a lot of stories in popular culture, and more recently in research on post-traumatic growth. There's this very popular idea that adversity and sometimes even horrible life experiences that happen to us early on can maybe lead to post-traumatic growth, which then can propel us towards success. And if you look in Hamilton's life story, indeed, so like I said earlier, he had a lot of traumatic experiences, and then which culminated with this devastating hurricane that hit his Caribbean island, and then as a result of that, he wrote this letter that impressed people so much that they collected funds to send him to the North American colonies to get his education. Which brings me to what economists would say when asked about what leads to career success, and they might say more proximal predictor is educational attainment, and that all the other things we talked about so far, like personality, intelligence, and SES, they only predict career success to the extent to which they predict educational attainment, so through their effect on education. Indeed, Hamilton goes with this collected funds. He goes, gets his education in the North American colonies and contributes to founding the United States. So in today's talk, I'd like to deconvolute these stories we tell about what kind of factors predict career success across the lifespan using multiple longitudinal studies across diverse samples from the US and Europe, and ask 4 broad research questions. 1, how does personality, so to start at the beginning, how does personality predict career success across the lifespan? And I'll break that down as we go. 2, how does personality change across the lifespan? Because maybe personality, we can't talk about how it predicts outcomes if we don't know whether it's dynamic and like what those dynamics look like. 3, which life experiences co-develop with personality? And 4, does personality change in itself predict career success? So not just the static one-time measurement, but development across time, does that predict career success? So regarding the first question, the first aspect of that question of how does personality predict career success across the lifespan was the simplest thing you can think of, which is, does personality show incremental validity over parental SES in predicting career success across the lifespan? So basically, are the sociologists right that it's all about SES, or do psychologists have something to contribute? And there's been research done on this before, but I'll show you the results on the sample I was working with. So this is the independent effects model. And then the second question I wanted to ask regarding this is, do the effects replicate over a shorter versus longer period time spans? So if you take someone's personality when they're 16, is that measurement of personality impacting their career success, predicting their career success more strongly 11 years later or 50 years later? And there are 2 possibilities there. On the one hand, it's possible that the effects are stronger over a shorter time span because they might dissipate over a longer time span, personality might change in between, more life events might intervene, or it's possible the effects are weaker over the shorter versus longer time span because the career success measure would be less valid because you might not have achieved yet your full potential. So to address this question, I used the Project Talent sample, which is a large representative sample of US high school students. Data collection started in 1960, and I used here data from the original survey, and then data when people were 16, and 11 years later, and 50 years later. We had measures of parental socioeconomic status, intelligence composite, demographics, and for personality traits, I'll show you here today results for leadership and mature personality. And we did a validation study on a sample of 3,000 people, and they most closely, of the big 5, they most closely map onto, so leadership would map onto the dominance facets of extroversion, and mature personality, it's basically a measure of conscientiousness. This is before, so the 1960 data set, this is before the big 5 or modern personality assessments were invented. So we worked with what's available, but validated them against established measures. So we had a measure of educational attainment. So this is, there are about 2 years of education between each point of the scale, annual income, and occupational prestige coded from self-reported job titles. And these measures were available 11 years after the personality assessment, as well as 50 years later. And for occupational prestige, for people who are retired, we used their last, basically their highest attained kind of job. So here are the results. You can see here the predictors at age 16, and then educational attainment at age 27. I wanted to focus on, so intelligence had a large effect, but also leadership and mature personality or conscientiousness had meaningful effects. These are standardized regression coefficients with 95% confidence intervals, and all the effects show independent effects on the outcome. And then the results, the effects replicated 50 years later as well. So there didn't appear to be a big difference in effect size. It might make sense because you might think that educational attainment doesn't change much, and indeed, educational attainment at 27 recorded about 0.8 with educational attainment at 66, but there were some people who continued their education later in life. All right, so in terms of income, again, we can see that intelligence and personality both contribute above and beyond the effects of parental socioeconomic status 11 years later, and then the effects seem a little bit larger for intelligence and leadership 50 years later, but smaller for mature personality. And then, so again, this supports the idea that personality has something valuable to add above and beyond just SES and intelligence. And then for occupational prestige, the effects pretty much mirror the other effects we've seen so far, where there's incremental validity by personality. So because these effects are kind of difficult to interpret, this is what the results would look in a raw metric. So for intelligence, if someone when they were 16 were to magically jump from -1 to 1 standard deviation in intelligence, they would gain, regardless of their parental socioeconomic status, 20 additional months of education 11 years later. So that's the equivalent of about 2 academic years, the difference between an associate's and a college degree. And for leadership, going from -1 to +1 standard deviation when you're 16 in leadership would predict an increase of 4% in income 11 years later. And we calculated that the mean US income, that's about $2,500 a year. So clearly there's evidence that the sociologists are not completely right. It's not all SES. SES matters, but we've got something to add with personality, which is great because that's what you all do. So, all right. So, how does the second question I wanted to address is what the economists are saying. So, are all these effects of personality on career success explained through educational attainment, or are there some, which is called the transactional model, or does personality add something when it comes to predicting later career success above and beyond its indirect effect through education? So if you do apply a back model to the same data I talked about, so here you have the predictors measured at age 16, and the educational attainment at 66 as a mediator, and income at age 66 as an outcome. Most of so everything other than gender had statistically significant indirect effects through education, so there's evidence for the transactional model, as the economists would suggest. But intelligence and leadership still had direct effects on later income, above and beyond their indirect effect through educational attainment. So being higher in leadership at age 16 did something for your income 50 years later, beyond getting you a higher education. And similar findings can be observed for occupational prestige, where there were indeed indirect effects to education, but there were remained direct effects of personality on later prestige, above and beyond their indirect effect to education. Then the next question we had, do these findings replicate cross-culturally? Because this study was done in the US. We did a study on a representative sample from Luxembourg. This was a very similar design to the one in the US. Longitudinal started in the 60s. And here I used data from the original survey, and at the 40th year follow-up, and the age was 12 at time 1 and 52 at time 2. Oops, oh no, okay. We had measures of SES, intelligence, again, gender, and for personality traits, again, the big five did not exist. So we had the self-reported and teacher-rated personality. For self-reported, we had the measure of responsibility, which mapped on pretty well on conscientiousness in the validation study, sense of inferiority, which mapped onto neuroticism, and defiance of parental authority, which mapped onto low agreeableness and leadership. And we have teacher-rated industriousness, which is a facet of conscientiousness. And again, educational attainment, monthly income, and occupational prestige coded from self-reported job titles, similar to what we did in the US study. And here are the results from the path models, the predictors at age 12, educational attainment at 52 as a mediator, and income at 52. And we can see that, so there were again indirect effects through education, as the transactional model would predict, but IQ and defiance of parental authority still predicted later income above and beyond their indirect effects through education. And for occupational prestige, responsibility, how responsible children were at age 12, and how industrious they were rated by their teachers, predicted occupational prestige 40 years later, above and beyond their indirect effects through education. So there's something about those personality traits that directly impact your career success, not just through education. So the last question I wanted to address regarding how personality predicts career success across the lifespan is whether the effects of personality and background factors are linear, so they're just additive, as we showed in the first models, or multiplicative. So if you, there's a line in Hamilton about where Miranda says, for someone less astute would have been dead and destitute. So there's the implication that not everybody would have dealt equally well with the terrible circumstances that life had dealt Hamilton, and that maybe something in his personality could have been used as a resource substitute. So there's indeed this theory that of resource substitution. There's a substitution hypothesis, which is the idea that at lower levels of SES, you might benefit more from an adaptive trait, because that trait might substitute for your background disadvantage. And then the other hypothesis is the Matthew effect, or the rich get richer hypothesis, which is that if you have adaptive traits, you're going to benefit even more from them if you're at higher levels of SES, because you can take better advantage of your resources. So can personality compensate for background disadvantage? And results also from the Project Talent data. Here you can see response surface graph with education, so going from low to high, and then parental SES predicted by parental SES and conscientiousness, with parental SES going from low to high and conscientiousness low to high. And you can see several things. So the main effect of socioeconomic status, where people of higher socioeconomic status attain higher levels of education. The main effect of conscientiousness, where people with high levels of conscientiousness attain higher levels of education. And then you can, so the slope here and the slope here is your interaction effect, which basically shows evidence for resource substitution, because you have a steeper slope at low levels of SES compared to high levels of SES. So in other words, at low levels of SES, conscientiousness helps you more in attaining higher levels of education. Or another way to say this is at high levels of SES, it doesn't matter if you're lazy, you'll still get the college degree. If you think about the compensation, can personality compensate for a background disadvantage, which is what the editor wanted to see. So the editor wanted this graph, which was a great addition to the paper, I thought. But the compensation the editor was longing for were these two corners, the compensation effect. So the hardest working but poorest person in the sample barely attained an associate's degree on average, and versus the wealthiest, laziest person in the sample still attained a college degree. So there isn't a full compensation effect when you think of it like that. All right, with intelligence, you can see evidence for a Matthew effect, where actually people who are more intelligent, so people at higher levels of SES benefited more from higher levels of intelligence. So it was kind of the rich get richer hypothesis. And there seemed to be more of that compensation effect, where people attained at the highest levels of intelligence but low SES more than an associate's degree, and lowest levels of intelligence but highest SES also about that. So when you think of the American dream, I would agree with if you think of the American dream as everybody who works hard enough can achieve anything, I would agree with George Carlin, which is that's why they call it the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it, at least when it comes to hard work, because there's still, although there is, still, I'm not trying, personality, like higher levels of conscientiousness will help you more, will help you, right? And they will even help you more at lower levels of SES, but they won't fully compensate for SES differences. So in summary, regarding that first broad question, personality does show incremental validity over and above SES in predicting career success decades later. There's some evidence for mediation, but still evidence for direct effects, and some evidence for interaction effects, but those effects are very small. So I would say that overall, the most reliable model is probably the additive effects model of these three. All right, so how does personality, the second question, how does personality change across the lifespan? And there's been a lot of work on this, this study I'm going to present now was the longest, the longest study across the longest time period, where the same sample was assessed with using the same kind of assessment. It was self-report at both time points. So this was also from Project Talent. And I'm going to show you the effects for all the 10 traits, which we mapped onto the Big Five. So we looked at there are different kinds of stability and change. So there's rank order stability, where you look at how similar are people's rankings relative to each other across time. So are people who were the most sociable person at 16 still going to be the most sociable person at 66 or 50 years later? A mean level change, how does the average personality of the group changes across the two time points, and the individual level change, what percentage of people increase versus decrease reliably. And these are the results for rank order stability across the 50 years. The purple bars are the raw correlation coefficients, and you can't really see, apologize, but I'll give you the summary. So these are all the different personality traits, and the gray bars are adjusted for measurement error. But in summary, the average rank order stability corrected for measurement error was, based on the validation study, was about 0.31, and uncorrected was 0.23 across 50 years. So our ranks relative to each other had that amount of stability. And these numbers are consistent with meta-analytic estimates that include both the genetic component as well as the person-environment transaction and random life events component in personality development. Because if you think about it, so if personality was entirely genetically determined, then that correlation should be a lot higher, even across 50 years. If personality was entirely random, as someone like Walter Mischel might have said, then you would see across 50 years that correlate should asymptote to 0, because we have a lot of meta-analytic data on stability across shorter and increasingly longer periods of time. So eventually you should see that asymptoting to 0, but it did not. So, and in terms of mean level change, there were quite large across the 50 years, more than a standard deviation, increases in calmness or emotional stability, mature personality, conscientiousness, and social sensitivity, which is similar to agreeableness. So the average mean level change was half of a standard deviation across the personality traits, which was larger than what was observed in meta-analyses that put together studies that had an average of about 10 years. So that was a quarter of a standard deviation, and this was half a standard deviation, which means that personality change accumulates across the lifespan. So personality has a high degree of plasticity and keeps changing as you age. It doesn't just stop, in teenage years or young adulthood. And the pattern of change showed maturation. So maturation meaning like getting better at life, at forming lasting relationships and achieving career goals. So people became more emotionally stable, agreeable, and conscientious as they aged. But there was a high degree of individual level change as well. So if you look at calmness, for example, yes, the average, the pattern showed maturity, which is like an increase in stability, but there were some people, so 3% of people actually decreased. So what happened there? There's a lot of variability. So in summary, regarding this change question, personality seems to have a stable component across the lifespan, but it's also malleable and people change in a maturational direction. And the mean level change was consistent with the cumulative, so plasticity versus set point model. So set point model is, as I was saying earlier, when personality kind of stops changing after a certain age. And the fact that we see individual differences in change, so not everybody changes the same way, that also suggests that personal experiences might shape change, as opposed to there's this idea that sure, people change, but it could still be genetic. It could be like a genetically programmed change, kind of like puberty. But the fact that there are individual differences suggests that's probably not the case, and it's more likely that change might be happening because of random life experiences or environmental things. So which factors do and do not contribute to personality change? And that brings me to my third question of which life experiences co-develop with personality. And the first one I wanted to address is birth order, because everybody has one, even only children. That's only child is birth order. It's such a pervasive human experience that everyone has an opinion and feels quite strongly about how birth order might impact their personality. There's lots of books written about this, lots of parenting books telling you how to treat your children based on their birth order. And there's this theory, the birth order theory, inspired by evolutionary models, suggesting that the firstborn picks a more traditional niche in order to get parental investment. So that's why the firstborn should be more neurotic, because they're worried about parent pleasing, but also more dominant and more conscientious. Versus laterborns have to pick a different niche to get attention, because the first one is taken, the traditional niche is taken, so they have to be more creative and sociable and fun and nice to other people. So data on 250,000 people that we collected suggests the association between birth order and any of the traits is 0. And so that's number one. And by the way, the effects, in the theory, the effects are supposed to be so large that they're visible with the naked eye, so that they should be about 1 standard deviation, because everybody should be able to notice them, right? So, and we have research on how big effects have to be noticeable by regular people, by observers. So that's number one, very small effects. Number two, they don't go in the predicted direction. So for example, firstborns appeared slightly higher in calmness and self-confidence, both indicators of emotional stability, versus the theory would have suggested they should be more neurotic. Firstborns were also more socially sensitive or more agreeable slightly. Again, this is very close to 0, but it's still in the opposite direction from the theory. And the effects were very reliably estimated. As you can imagine, the confidence intervals are very tight around that with 250,000 people. So maybe birth order, not such a strong developmental experience for, well, birth order could still be really important if society decides to treat you based on it, right? So we had historically primogeniture practices where you have still the firstborn gets the throne of the UK, so it's still, it can impact your life for sure if society decides it should impact your life. But there's no reason to believe right now that birth order is related to personality differences. All right, so regarding other life experiences that might co-develop with personality, we know from prior research that transitional life experiences like getting hired, married, maybe social investment, although this is a little bit disputed whether having a child changes your personality or not. There's a volitional change, so wanting to change your personality and then making specific clear goals, implementation intentions. Therapy has been shown to contribute to changing personality. And today I'm going to talk about school experiences and their co-development with personality. Home experiences like chores, so for school experiences is homework, and home experiences like chores, and adverse experiences, natural disaster. So before I get into each of the experiences and how it may co-develop with personality, I wanted to address the issue of why would life experiences shape personality development. So for this, the Tessera framework suggests that each experience may serve as a trigger, an external press for behavior. So for example, when your teacher assigns homework, that assignment triggers an expectation for how well you should perform and submitting your homework. And then that can lead to states and state expressions. You either persist or not in your homework, and then reactions. So, for example, your teacher may praise you for doing your homework very well, in which case you'll feel good about it. And then if this sequence repeats over and over again, either actual repetition or psychologically, for example, if you had a traumatic experience, you might replay it in your mind over and over. Then through associative and reflective processes, this can lead to long-term personality change. Because let's say you do your homework over and over, and you persist, and you do well, and you get praised, so then slowly you start thinking of yourself as someone who is really good at doing things on time and persisting in the face of obstacles or boredom or whatever. All right, so then they might become more conscientious by changing their overall distribution of traits. So in a study of 2,700 Germans that were tested every year between grades 5 and 8, we looked at the co-development of homework behavior and personality change, and we showed using bivariate latent change models and propensity score matching that homework effort and conscientiousness were systematically related over time, such that students who invested more effort into their homework showed a more positive development in conscientiousness. This was both based on self-reports and parent reports. So doing your homework is good for your conscientiousness. And as someone who has always negotiated with my parents to do more homework to get out of chores, the natural next question I had is whether doing household chores in childhood or early on can impact personality development or can co-develop with personality. And recently there was a bill introduced in the Spanish parliament that would have made it illegal for children not to do chores in Spain. So all the children would have been had to do chores. The bill did not pass, but there is this idea that chores are very good for developing your character and for increasing conscientiousness, basically. So I wanted to test that idea. And to do that, so I looked at the study that had measures of how many chores children are doing and what their effortful control. So that's the temperamental core of conscientiousness, how good you are at inhibiting impulses, that kind of stuff. And I used a sample of 674 Mexican origin youth from California. This longitudinal study assessed the children at ages 10, 12, 14, and 16, and then later at 19. I'll talk about that later. So chores and effortful control, so the number of chores they were doing and effortful control were measured at each of those time points Participant retention was extremely high. It was above 90% at every wave. And we also did all the analysis, both controlling for IQ and demographics and not, and there were no differences. And I'll explain the bivariate latent growth curve model. So first, based on the 4 time assessments of the amount of chores children were doing, we could extract with that model, so the level, which is how many chores they were doing at age 10, as well as the rate of change, so the slope of how many chores how they increased in doing chores from 10 to 16. Then we did the same thing for effortful control, so you can get the level, so effortful control at age 10, and then rate of change between 10 and 16, that's the slope. And then you can do interesting things to look at co-development, because you can ask, you can start correlating these levels and slopes, and you can ask, is the rate of change in chore behavior correlated with the rate of change in effortful control? So are people who are children who start doing more and more chores from ages 10 to 16 also increasing in effortful control over that same time period? Or are children, for example, who start off as higher in chore effort increasing at the higher rate across that period? And doing all that, we basically found no reliable evidence of co-development of chores and effortful control. So none of those correlations were statistically significant, and they're all lower than a correlation of 0.10. And that's despite evidence from the same sample, so the exact same sample that showed that school behavioral problems did co-develop with effortful control. So children who increasingly skipped school, for example, between 10 and 16, did decrease increasingly in effortful control over that same period. So again, there's evidence that these school kind of experiences co-develop a personality, but not the home experiences. And actually, something that Bob said earlier today in the meeting was that maybe we didn't catch them early enough. So maybe by the time they're 10, they no longer care about their parents. They mostly focus on what the peers are doing, and that's why the school experiences impact their development more. That's a very, very cool point. So maybe chores don't matter for personality development, but they do still predict future chore behavior, I should say that. So it's very highly stable. Chore effort was very highly stable in the sample. And that's chore behavior is certainly good for relationships and everything. So, the limitations of this is, as I said earlier, maybe chores were not measured early enough. Definitely something to look into. And also maybe our chore measure was not sensitive enough because we just had the number of chores as opposed to the quality. So there's some evidence to suggest that if you just pay your children to do chores, that might not have the same beneficial effects as if you do chores together as a family to see how that improves family life and that kind of thing. So we just had the number of chores they were doing. So maybe chores are still good. And the last kind of experience I wanted to discuss were adverse experiences and personality change. And there's a huge literature on post-traumatic growth. But is this thing real or is it wishful thinking? So we hear a lot about post-traumatic growth, but the vast majority of the research in this area uses retrospective self-reports of growth. So what they do is they bring people in the lab, sometimes years after an event they experienced, and they ask them, how have you grown from this traumatic experience? And often, of course, the study is advertised as a study for people who've suffered of a specific experience. So these are the people who show up in the lab to tell you all about it. And there's a single study looking at differences between this perceived versus actual growth, and the correlation was 0. So post-traumatic growth, the post-traumatic growth literature has some problems, also very small samples, and even though they theorize personality change, they never measure it. And there's a lack of an individual difference perspective. So I was thinking of all these things, and then Hurricane Harvey hit Houston in 2017, and this is a picture I took from near my apartment. Immediately, as soon as the rain stopped and we were allowed out, we could get out of the house, and that's a picture a few months later. So the river is quite a bit bigger, this was it was the second most costly hurricane in U.S. history after Katrina. and $125 billion in costs, and we got 60 inches of rain within 4 days. And I still remember it was very nice that Ryan offered to host us in Lubbock, that if we were to be evacuated. So it was one of the really sweet messages, because we're all trapped in the apartment, couldn't get out for more than a week. There's a foot of water like surrounding everything, completely isolated. And I was getting all these nice messages because we still had power. So that was really nice. So thank you. We didn't end up being evacuated, and we were not flooded because I was in a third floor apartment. But so as this hurricane was raging outside, I was wondering how Houston is going to cope with this over the following year in the aftermath of the hurricane, and what would happen to people who were exposed to it. And I had lots of friends who were really badly affected. So I was looking through some of the research and saw from the clinical literature that it appears that development within the first year after experiencing a disaster is critical, but there are very few longitudinal studies of natural disaster victims. The few that there are, they have only PTSD focus, really small samples, like really small, less than 60 people, lack of an individual difference perspective. So I decided to collect some data. So during the hurricane, because there was nothing else to do, and we were fortunate not to be flooded and to still have electricity, started designing the study and prepared the IRB. And then because of that, we were able to start data collection within 1 month after the hurricane, which is quite rare. So most of the previous studies on natural disasters sometimes collect data 10 years after the disaster. And the target participant sample were University of Houston college students. And I wanted to focus on emerging adulthood because this is a critical developmental period across life domains. And the question was, do emerging adults' personalities change in the year following the hurricane? And is the extent of change in personality correlated with how much they were impacted by the hurricane? So the inclusion criteria was to be enrolled as a UH student and to have lived in the Houston area during Hurricane Harvey. At wave 1, I got 691 participants collected about a month after Harvey. And at wave 2, this was a year later, I had 383, so 55% retention rate, so collected a year later. And the attrition analysis suggests that there were no statistically significant differences in any of the personality traits, or hurricane impact was a correlation of 0.02. So because I was worried that maybe people who were more impacted would drop out at higher rates, but that was not the case. And all the correlations were less than 0.07 for the attrition analysis. Right, so the sample was average age 22, mostly female because it's a college sample, 70%, although we tried. Very diverse. This is quite reflective of Houston as the most diverse city in America and our university population. Parental SCS is about US average. So we had demographics, direct exposure during Hurricane Harvey. So we had objective measures of exposure. So damage to your home vehicle, inches of home flooding, damage cost, and different hurricane stressors. And then the big 5 personality traits, which showed strong measurement in variance across time. So people used the scales in the same way across the year gap. And here are descriptives of how impacted our sample was. If you look across all the items and ask, recoded to see how many participants had any of those direct impacts, 70% of the sample had at least one of those direct impacts. So this was a really bad flooding event. A lot of people were flooded. The university was closed. The university had some damage too, several of my colleagues, and so on. So in terms of the descriptives for each of the items, so on average people had some damage to their home, some damage to their vehicle, an average of 2 inches of water in their house, although this was a skewed distribution, and some costs, and then at least on average of 1 hurricane stressor, such as not having enough water to drink, or not knowing whether your family was safe, and things like that. So regarding personality change in the year following the hurricane, I used latent change models, and I found that the mean level trend of change was very close to 0 for each of the traits. So that suggests that there's no evidence of change during the year following the hurricane. This has a caveat, of course. It's because we did not have a measure of personality before the hurricane. It's possible we missed it and that it happened in that month when we didn't assess it. But it's not unreasonable to also say that maybe most of the change, you'd expect most of the change to happen during the aftermath, the year aftermath, which is when you actually have to deal with all the issues caused by the flooding. So, and I'll come back to this later. But despite the fact that there's no mean level trend in change, so not everybody changed in a specific way, basically, on average, there was significant variance in the rates of change. So people differed a lot. There were individual differences in how people changed following the hurricane. So like I said, there's no mean level personality change observed in this study, but variability in change. Also hurricane exposure, so the extent to which they were directly impacted by the hurricane was not significantly associated with personality change in the following year. But just to kind of speak to the validity of the measure, because I was worried, I'm like, well, maybe this measure doesn't predict anything. It actually had quite strong prospective effects on well-being, semester grade point average, even when controlling for pre-hurricane grade point average. So I had got their official records. So I did have a pre-post measure there. So hurricane exposure did contribute, did predict prospectively well-being, so depression, anxiety, and lower GPA. So the more exposed students had lower semester GPA. Even when controlling for pre-hurricane GPA. So it does have predictability, the measure, but it did not predict personality change. So like I said, the limitation is the lack of a pre-hurricane personality measure, but there's a single other study of natural disasters and personality change, and that's a study on the Christchurch earthquakes in New Zealand. And they did have a measure of personality before the earthquakes, and they also found 0 change before and after the earthquakes. So perhaps adverse experiences don't contribute to personality change in a consistent way for everybody, which is good news, right? Because if we would find a mean level trend, then it'd be more difficult to find individual differences in change patterns after experiences, more difficult for Hamilton to cope with all the horrible things that happened to him. So this is potentially, it's good news for the participants that even a traumatic life experience doesn't change everybody in the same way or in a negative way. But there's also no strong evidence for the post-traumatic growth idea. So there's some wishful thinking there, potentially. Another limitation is that 1 year is a short time span. Maybe if we assess them after a longer period of time, maybe more change could accumulate. But at the same time, we do know that change can happen quickly, in as little as 20 therapy sessions. And this was a traumatic experience, so that's, but it's still a limitation. All right. So the last question I wanted to address today is whether personality change in itself predicts career outcomes above and beyond its initial level whenever you assessed it. So there is extensive prior evidence for the prospective role of personality level on career outcomes, but I was only able to find 2 studies on whether personality change can impact career outcomes, can predict career outcomes prospectively above and beyond the personality measured at one time point. And both studies found evidence for the incremental role of personality change in predicting career outcomes, but they didn't have SES and IQ controls and only used self-reports. So I wanted to test this again. And this is really important to look at whether change can predict career outcomes, because that's relevant for interventions. So if you can show that change, regardless of where you start off, that improving, for example, in conscientiousness, regardless of where you start off, that improving helps the career outcomes, that means an intervention would be really useful for for whatever level you're at. So all is not lost. And another really interesting question we would have to address with this is, at which developmental time period would an intervention be most effective? So to begin to address these questions, I again looked at the Mexican origin youth sample from California that I talked about earlier. And here, as I said, I had the effortful control development from 10 to 16. And job outcomes, and I know this is early, this is the last available wave of data at 19. But I should say this is a fairly low SCS sample, and the average income is $30,000 a year. So because of that, many of them have to work to support their families. So 58.8% of them were already employed, either full or part-time, by age 19. So that's what the analyses are focused on. And I don't have, the data set doesn't have job performance measures, unfortunately, but there are other types of job outcomes, like job fit, autonomy, job satisfaction, kind of the regular things you see in IO articles. So the question was whether effortful control development, its initial level at age 10, as well as the rate of change between 10 and 16, whether how those predict job outcomes in young adulthood, and whether that rate of change, whether the slope of effortful control predicts job outcomes above and beyond the initial level. And here are the results. You can see here the different job outcomes, so job satisfaction, satisfaction with job performance, job stress, job fit, job autonomy, and work relationship conflict. And for the effortful control level, so that's how high you are in effortful control at age 10, you can see that children who were higher in effortful control at age 10 had lower job stress 9 years later, and more job fit 9 years later. And above and beyond those initial levels, children who increased in effortful control from 10 to 16 had higher job satisfaction and higher job autonomy. And the results were quite variable, as you can see, across the different outcomes, and this is consistent with what the other two studies found. The effects vary, although they were in the predicted direction for all the outcomes. So higher initial levels of effortful control at age 10, as well as more positive changes in effortful control from 10 to 16, predicted better job outcomes in young adulthood. So in summary, personality change can predict better job outcomes. It might matter for future success, but the limitation is that the job outcomes at this early age are likely not highly valid. So I look forward to future waves of data and other data sets to look at. So the take-home messages for today's talk, I think, are that personality matters for career success across the lifespan. Personality changes across the lifespan in a maturational direction. We all get better like wine as we age. And life experiences may contribute to personality change. School experiences co-develop a personality. I did not find evidence for home and adverse experiences for co-developing a personality, and I did not find evidence for post-traumatic growth, at least not on average, but there were significant individual differences in change. And personality change appears to matter as well for job outcomes. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, my collaborators, my lab, and my funding. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
Do you think there might be any difference on the adverse experiences depending on the source of the adverse experience, like
yes.
a mass shooting compared to an act of nature?
Yeah. So there's one idea that I really want to test. I've been talking to some people. We need to find the right data sets because it's quite difficult. So the problem is, well, it's not the problem. It's good that it's a low base rate for adverse experiences, so it's good. But yeah, so there's one idea is that if experiences are not a betrayal, so something that somebody specifically does to you, and especially if it's something that happens to everybody, that actually might be less traumatic. So because my personal experience, at least with Hurricane Harvey, but again I wasn't flooded myself, so I was very lucky. But my personal experience was that the city was actually quite like united afterwards. Like everybody kind of came together, helped each other. Like there was kind of an outpouring of support, and so that's almost it felt like that's better than if you like kind of go through this quiet desperation of a personal drama that nobody knows. Like everybody moves on with their lives, and you're like have something horrible happen to you. So there's one aspect is how much people are in it together, and then the other aspect is the betrayal thing. Is it something that was external that nobody had control over, or is it something that somebody did to you that's really hurtful? So yeah, so very interesting. So I think that there is potential for different kinds of adversity to impact people differently. But I also think that I don't know, I'm not sure if it's reasonable to expect even in that case, if it's reasonable to expect a mean level pattern, to expect that everybody changes in the same way. That seems, I didn't believe that would be the case when I tested it, but I tested it because this post-traumatic growth idea is so popular, but I mean, even they kind of started admitting that maybe it's not everybody who grows. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Yes?
You showed those three-dimensional tables and used the IQ and conscientious variable.
Yes.
Is there a reason you didn't use the leadership personality variable?
Yeah, I think it was, I didn't think that this group would be more interested in that. It is in the paper, so in the paper you can find all of the different scales with all of the different results, and I think leadership also showed resource substitution. So I think the reason it was random and I didn't, think ahead.
So for lower SES with leadership?
I think leadership would help you more, yes, at lower SES, yeah. But all of these interaction effects were really small, so they're about the standardized beta coefficient of like 0.01, 0.02, so you wouldn't find them, in a sample less than 10,000 people. But yeah, I think leadership was definitely helpful as well. I just I should have put that on the slide, but I was trying to save time because I have tons of slides. Thank you for that question. Yes.
What do you think the clues are to Hamilton's success?
Oh, that's a really good question. Oh, I didn't prepare that. Okay, so I think he was very ambitious based on, I'm also confounding like reality with what Miranda said about it. But he seemed really ambitious and hardworking. So there's this time when he was defending the Constitution and like wrote, I forgot how many dozens of letters. Like Madison just gave up after 5 letters, and he wrote something more than 50 by himself. So he was clearly extreme. Like when he got onto something, he was really focused on it. He was extremely charismatic. Like good-looking, charismatic. Could get everybody riled up and excited. So I do think that it's probably leadership, and he was clearly a really smart guy as well. And so I think it's personality. And I think that its personality is also responsible for how people kind of, grow and deal with those adverse experiences. It's just, I don't know why, and I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on this, it's not actually, it's quite rare to find an interaction between like an adverse event and personality in predicting some outcome. So even though it makes so much sense, you could say, well, of course, someone who's less neurotic is not going to react as badly to this horrible event that happened to them. So it makes sense to predict an interaction, but I've never been able to find an interaction. I don't think I've tested it on this particular study because the data are still quite fresh, but I've tested it in other samples. So that's the question that I'm really, really interested in, is what are the individual difference factors? Because it's clear to me that you have to look at it at the individual difference level, because there is no mean level way in which everybody reacts to the same life experience. So what are the key factors that help people overcome adversity and thrive and show career success? And I think it's personality. Maybe we have to look at the more facet level, or what do you think?
I just think Hamilton was a really impressive guy.
He was.
In terms of his life achievement, and he was quite gifted, really smart, really good looking.
Yeah.
Washington thought he was the most talented guy he had around him.
Yeah. He was just, charismatic, smart, and it also wrote beautifully. I mean, people were brought, he was 14 when he wrote that the account of the hurricane, no, not 14, he was 17. And people were like brought to tears that everybody collected money to send him to college. I mean, that's, to write that well, that's a good skill.
I think it's because he was Scottish.
Maybe. Are you Scottish? Yes.
In one of your past studies, you said that you had quantified when the observable differences when differences in personality scales were more observable. Did you find those differences vary across scales, or is it always?
I didn't do that study. That was a past study, which I can't remember the citation right now, but I can send it to you. So, oh, actually, I don't know your email address, but I will send it to you. I don't want to lie here. But yes, I will find that study and somehow you'll get it. So, because I can't remember right now how it differed. But although we do know research by Samin Vazir suggests that, yes, some traits are more observable than others. So like neuroticism is less observable because you tend to not tell everybody how much you worry about things, unless you're also highly extroverted, maybe.
I was thinking more on our personality metric, certainly on schools, where we talk about the differences in behaviors and largely based on our collected observations, right? And we kind of draw a line in the sand. If there's data that can either help us support that or
nice.
Based on when other independent researchers are seeing the observations change and how far away from the mean that is.
Oh yeah.
It's a good supporting resource.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, actually, yeah. So that's too. So I don't. Yeah. Sorry, I think I might have missed a part of the question. So, yeah. So I think that there are differences in how observable different traits are, and I think it'd be amazing because you guys, will probably have a ton of data on observer. Yeah, you have a lot of data on observer and self-reports, and yeah, that's really interesting.
Okay, so
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. As you all may have noted in Blake's email earlier this week, there is wine and some sort of snacks in the bistro, and so if you want to talk with Rodica more, we will be down there shortly. Otherwise, you can go back to work.